Financial leadership is changing. CFOs no longer record history. They make history. This podcast will help you become a better leader, strategic thinker, and digital visionary. Welcome to Secrets of Rockstar CFOs, the ultimate podcast for chief financial officers. Follow along as Jack McCullough engages in exciting chats with accomplished CFOs, learning how they overcame obstacles and positioned their companies for the future. Here's your host, Jack McCullough.
Hello, Rockstars, and welcome to another episode of the Secrets of Rockstar CFOs. I'm your host, Jack McCullough. Before we start out, a big shout out to our sponsors, Plantful and Travel Bank. We have a great guest today, so let's rock. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Secrets of Rockstar CFOs. I'm your host, Jack McCullough, and you can find us online at rockstarcfos.com. We have a great guest today, and I'm anxious to get to it, so let's rock and roll. My guest is Davinder Athwal. He's the CFO of Phenom. Phenom is a global AI company specializing in HR. Davinder, welcome to the Secrets of Rockstar CFOs.
Hi, Jack. Great to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, me too. And I do tend to oversimplify things a little bit. That works for me. But maybe you can share a little bit more about your company.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. So the company's been founded with a purpose. The purpose is to help 1 billion people discover the right work. And I'll get into how we do that and why that's important. Not a household name, so most people likely have not heard of us, but I would say there's a pretty good chance that anyone who's been on a careers website in the last 10 years has likely used our product in some fashion in the back end, because we power some of the career websites for some of the biggest companies in the world and some of the best known brands as well around the globe. And what we do at our core, think about it like this, Jack. So if you go to a typical LinkedIn profile, let's say for a knowledge worker, people might self-identify 15 or 20 skills that they claim to have. And that's not unusual for most knowledge workers. The reality, though, is that those people have about 100 skills that they possess. They may not be aware of all of them, may not remember them on a particular day. They may not think they're relevant. Or they just, missed them in some fashion. So what we can do is we can take the 15 or 20 skills that you self-identify, using our algorithm, using our database of over 1 billion candidates, we can extrapolate what the balance of those skills are with a very high degree of accuracy. We do the same thing on the job site. You think about a typical job description, it might have half a dozen, maybe 10 requirements that are listed. There's actually about 55 to 60 for most jobs. And our algorithm does the same thing in that respect as well. And then ultimately, it's about pattern matching. What we do is we take the 100 skills that a candidate possesses, and we take the 55 skills that are needed to do the job. We overlay them. We look for fit to do the job. So at the core of all of this is really the paradigm shift from forcing, let's say, a resume to a job description to skills to work requirement.
That's fascinating. And, one thing that got my attention, which you said, but I read it off your website too, is that billion number. So you can't do more than that. You don't seem like you're very ambitious with that target.
That number is growing every day. It is people that have come through our customers' careers websites. But no, that number is actually increasing every single day. So that'll continue.
It's fantastic. And, I'm more in the finance space than HR, but they're tangential. And I have to admit, when I was, checking your company out, I was a little embarrassed that I was, passingly familiar with it at best. I'm like, how do I not know more about this company? I mean, it's such a success story, a couple hundred miles south of where I live. And, obviously there are implications for all executives, but CFOs being such a part of the talent process that, I do think it's the type of thing that we should be more cognizant of as financial leaders. So, but anyway, before we get into that, I want to ask a little bit about your own background. And can you share with us where you grew up and, what that was like?
Yeah, I grew up in the UK, about 20 miles southwest of London, working class town that likely nobody's ever heard of by the name of Slough. But it is actually right next to a very famous town called Windsor. So that's kind of where I grew up, and went through high school, went through college in London, moved to the United States with my family thereafter, graduating thereafter, and I've been here working really since that time. So I've got a kind of a dual or maybe even a triple kind of a cultural aspect to me. I'm Indian by heritage, so I grew up in a kind of a you could call it an Eastern Asian type of a household, but exposed to a European culture during my formative years, and really have been in North America for the last 25 years or so.
Yeah, you have, to me, it sounds like you have a Midwestern United States accent at this point, almost more than even an East Coast accent. So
Yeah, it varies depending on the day and the year, but yeah, I get that a lot.
yeah, mine varies. I have a Boston accent. I've always lived in the Boston area, and I don't have much of one except when I'm drinking. So then a couple of beers and it comes out. So,
Yeah.
but that's great. So you moved to the U.S., but before that, I know your father and some of his experience in England had a significant role in your approach, not only to your career, but it might be, fair to say it's a significant influence on how you really are leading your life. And I'd love to explore that if you're willing and able.
Yeah, I'd love to share that story because I think it's important, number one, to understand me, but I think it's also important because it did in some ways bring me to Phenom and really tied me in to that mission at Phenom that I just talked about a few minutes ago. So my parents moved to the UK from India in the mid '60s, and in India, my dad was a military trained engineer in a very fast growing field at the time around electronics and communications. And as he was thinking about transitioning into civilian life in India, there were a lot of companies that were practically lining up to hire him. And he had an opportunity to go to the UK and naturally assumed that it would be the same once he got there. Unfortunately, when he did get there, what he found was that, despite sending out countless applications, he wasn't really getting any kind of a response from employers. It makes you wonder, was it technology that different that he was using in India? Highly unlikely because most of it came from the UK or the US at the time. So the real issue really was that employers weren't really assessing his actual skills, Jack. What they were doing is in the absence of being able to do what I just described, kind of skills inference, they were kind of using proxies. And the proxies they would have used at the time would have been, where did you go to university? Who have you worked for? What's your job title been? And none of those really applied to him because he was in the military in a country that, none of these people really knew that well. And because of that, what ended up happening was he just couldn't find the right work, because nobody recognized his experience. And as a result of that, what I realized that, was he had been doing this work very proficiently. He'd been trained at a very high level, and literally people's lives depended on what he was doing when he was in the military. But he just couldn't get a chance to kind of apply that in the commercial space in the UK. And that really kind of, hit me hard. The first time I met Mahi, who was the co-founder and CEO of Phenom, and talked about his mission for Phenom, about kind of taking that off and kind of helping connect people to the right work.
Yeah, that's kind of an amazing tie-in. Such a thing that had an impact on you in your youth, and now you're working for a company that can make that thing go away. I mean, there are the fact, just we're in a different world than we were in the 1960s when your parents emigrated to England. But yeah, no, that's fantastic that you sort of have a technology to make sure that sort of thing doesn't get repeated. So, but I'd love to explore a little about your career path. You've worked for a few companies that I don't think anyone's ever heard of: PwC, IBM, Nortel. Clearly you work for some very large, well-respected companies. I'd love to chat a little about, what some of the lessons you learned along the way. Maybe if you could share some of your key mentors.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe if I can kind of give you, how I've approached my career before I kind of go into what I've done or where I've done it and why I did it. So my career has been really built around three kind of foundational aspects. It's around curiosity, it's around learning, and making an impact. And everywhere I've gone, I've kind of looked at the opportunity through that lens. So if you think about, going to PwC, that was easy, right? Because that's a place for coming out of college, a tremendous amount of opportunity to just learn, right? And if you're curious, you can actually learn even more. To my surprise, I actually did have an impact. Maybe not the first year where I was buying donuts and bagels for the team, but as I kind of progressed up to senior manager and saw companies go public and saw companies expand, in some cases have to go the other way and wind down operations, that work is very meaningful and very impactful. And certainly I would say very, necessary at that time to for those clients to do what they were trying to do. But that first experience was really around just learning the basic building blocks of a career, right? Like basically, how do you show up to work? How do you be a professional? How do you have that ethic of basically working to kind of get the job done? And from that, I loved that work. I really thought I'd end up being a partner at PwC in San Jose in the technology practice. But then something called Sarbanes-Oxley happened. And what that meant was I couldn't do the stuff that I really loved doing, which was actually helping and consulting clients around expansion and things like that. So I decided at that point that I would look elsewhere and found an opportunity to go to IBM. And what attracted me to IBM, Jack, was if you think about when I was at PwC, I was advising on accounting and finance impact. I went to IBM and became a part of their corporate development team, and now I was actually evaluating those impacts. And that's a mind shift change, right? So rather than just saying, here's 3 ways you can do this transaction, now I'm the guy that's actually trying to pick, the one of the 3 ways to do it. And it really helped me dial into kind of how do businesses create value? How do you create economics in an M&A deal, for instance, and things like that? Now, that was a tremendous experience. And I loved that time, and I thought for a while that I would have a career for the rest of my life at IBM. But I got a little impatient, right? So I used to work for the corporate treasurer at one point, and I remember having a year-end performance review, and I asked my boss at the time what it would take for me to get to the next level, which would have been a director level position. And the response was, keep on doing what you're doing, and you'll get there. And great, how long will that take? And the response is about 5 years. So I'm a patient person, but not that patient, right? So I was looking for other places to go and have an impact rather than kind of just bide my time. And that came, that kind of ability to have an impact and something much faster came in the form of Nortel. So you may recall Nortel at one point was a high-flying technology company, the dot-com boom, they 1/3 of the Toronto Stock Exchange, but then they fell on some hard times. What happened to them was, they used to be a hardware company, became a software company without realizing it, messed up their accounting. And so there's material weaknesses and all kinds of things that needed to be taken care of. So join them. It really was an opportunity that I thought about from the perspective of I'm certainly going to learn a lot here. I've got the ability to have a big impact if we can turn this around. And the curiosity was off the charts, right? Like, how do you do all of that stuff, while you're kind of trying to resuscitate a once great brand? And we actually did that. So I joined their corporate strategy team, and we came up with a great plan to basically downsize the business where we thought we didn't really have a right to win or we couldn't win, and take the proceeds and put those into places where we could win. And that plan was great. We were executing it, but then the 2008 financial crisis hit. And a big part of the cap structure at Nortel was leverage. And there was a huge balloon payment that we needed to refinance in early 2009. But after that crisis, we just couldn't get that done. So ended up putting the business into bankruptcy. Not the outcome I had hoped for going into the business, but I will say some of the greatest business lessons learned, through that process. After that, I actually took a bit of a right turn or left turn, but joined an energy company, which I, never thought I would do because I was always a technology, type of a person myself. But that opportunity came about early 2008, and you think about, at that time a new administration was forming, or kind of running for office, I guess. And there's a lot of excitement around renewables and things like that, and just what the energy space might do. So it was a way to kind of get into that disruptive space, if you will, and have an impact through that in a different way than I had anticipated. Ended up at UGI. We grew that business from $2 billion to $9 billion when I left there. A lot of disruption did come, but it wasn't the way we thought it was. It was through Marcellus Shale and other kinds of things that ultimately nobody had really predicted at the time. Loved that. I ultimately became the CFO for a business unit. That was my first CFO title. But really immensely enjoyed that work. At the end of that, kind of secondment that I had as the international guy, had a decision to make. Do I want to be in the energy space, or do I want to go back to technology? And had an opportunity to go back to technology, and that's what took me back into into a different role, but back in the technology space. Is my first time public company CFO role, and that was a great experience. And since then, I've been kind of in smaller businesses because that ability to have an impact in smaller businesses is just something that really drives me and excites me.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And a couple of things more for my own curiosity. Did you say Nortel was 1/3 of the Canadian stock market value?
It was in 1999,
Wow.
or
Yeah,
the TXS.
I worked for a startup, and like our exit plan was to get acquired by Cisco, Nortel, or Lucent. And Nortel, a different decision here and there, a lucky break here and there, and they could have been Cisco. I mean,
Yeah.
The technology, again, I'm a finance person, not a tech person, but sitting there, and I was pretty knowledgeable in the industry. I didn't see a whole lot of differences between the capabilities of the two companies. But yeah, Cisco sort of changed the game. They went on a buying spree, and they didn't make too many stumbles during their glory years, that's for sure. So they were extremely well done. So
yeah, and you're right, Jack. So you may recall there's a company called Bay Networks that used to be a direct competitor to Cisco, and Nortel acquired them. Yeah. And I would say that acquisition, didn't go as planned. So it's one of the classic example of overpaying for it, not integrating it, and getting all the synergies. And that's really what put them on that road to where they ended up, unfortunately.
Yeah, a friend of mine joined a startup which merged with a different startup. That combined company got acquired by Bay Networks, which got acquired by Nortel, which spun the company out. He had like 5 or 6 different companies, and he never changed offices. He was in the same chair every day through 6 companies. But it was a crazy time, to say the least.
Yeah,
cool.
For sure.
But anyway, it's you mentioned Sarbanes-Oxley, and a little bit of trivia. It was Sarbanes-Oxley was signed into law July 30th, 2002. Do you know how I remember that so exactly?
I don't.
My firstborn son was born the same day. I came home from the hospital, and I was a CFO of a private company, so it didn't really impact me all that much. But I was kind of upset when I learned it actually went through. So quite a time. But anyway, I'm going to ask you, a dumb question in the sense that I could probably answer it for myself. But you're with a great company, Phenom, and I'm curious, if there's a story between, how you became aware of the role and what attracted you to the opportunity. Perhaps that second part's fairly obvious, but I'd love to hear it anyway. So,
yeah, no, it's an interesting question, Jack, because I wasn't looking for a role. The first time I met with Mahi or spoke to Mahi, who's the CEO and co-founder, it wasn't really the idea of interviewing for the role. It was more out of curiosity. So I spent a number of years in California when I was with PwC, and really got to know the ecosystem around startups and software businesses, and just high-flying, tech in general quite a bit, and actually retained, a network of folks out there who I still rely on to today. But one of the people in that network was actually a recruiter, and he had called up and said, "Hey, do you know these guys, Phenom?" So I never heard of them, and he described, "Hey, yeah, they're an enterprise software business, they're a unicorn, and they're getting ready for an IPO." And my first reaction was, really, there's all of that here in Philadelphia? And I've never heard of them. I just gotta meet these guys just to see, what they're up to. And that's kind of what, led to a conversation with Mahi. And the conversation at all wasn't about the IPO or the business or anything like that. It was more of a philosophical conversation. It was a conversation about why Mahi believed, in the purpose of the business. The founders are 2 brothers. They're from India, and their dad actually had a business while they were growing up there. And one of the things that their parents impressed upon them was to make sure you create work for people, and make sure you create meaningful work for people. And that stuck with them. So they carried that thought and that vision. So when it came to kind of founding a company, they wanted to do something around that. And we talked about that a lot. I thought that was a fantastic, reason to be in business. And I could tell very clearly that this is not a business that's been founded, to kind of flip it or make a quick buck. It's really been founded with that purpose in mind. And everything the brothers have done and everything that I've done since I've been here for the last 3 years, it's been around how do we realize that vision? It's we rarely talk about the next fundraise or, kind of how do we grow more, for the sake of growing. It's always like, what do we need to do to get to that vision that we founded the company with? And that was it. So, I left there, and that kind of, I talked about my dad's experience and, some of the things that Mahi and I talked about. that's when that experience really emerged in my head as something that was, oh wait, this doesn't sound like this isn't what should have happened with my dad. Something different should happen. And the reality is, until you really think about these things, you kind of take them for granted. You kind of think, well, that's just how the world is. But when you see an ability to change it, and in a powerful way, it's a call to action. And that's exactly what happened to me, and here I am.
No, that's fantastic. And, it's interesting, all your experience beforehand, and they were with substantially bigger companies for the most part, but it really led you to this fantastic opportunity. And I'm curious, as we sort of look on your career path a little bit, what are the couple of lessons that you learned along the way that prepared you for this ultra high growth company? And I know that they remain private to this day, I believe. But it's a bit of a different challenge. But what are some of the lessons you learned, and maybe some key mentors that you had along the way?
Yeah, if I'll break that into two, if I can. One is the kind of the career journey, like how I prepared and the mentors and stuff like that. I think that was another aspect to this, which is a personal growth journey, which I think may be worth touching on as well. In terms of like the career path, it's really about adaptability, right? If you think back to what I said, if you're really serious about being curious what you're doing, curious where you are, and you want to learn and you want to have an impact, that's what you need in these smaller hyper growth type of businesses. Phenom, and I've seen many companies like Phenom. When I was out in Silicon Valley with PwC, some of the companies I took public were names like Yahoo and eBay, and a bunch of others that. Yeah, I'm going to say, but I never heard of those guys either. But many others that have since fallen by the wayside. But what they all had in common though was that they didn't know. They didn't have all the answers, and nobody at those companies has all the answers, because you're on the cutting edge of something new, and it's about applying the curiosity and the learning and the adaptability to kind of move the business forward. So that's kind of what you really need. And whether it was my experience at PwC or whether it was even at IBM, I created like one of the first, or co-created one of the first ERM programs. That was the cutting edge thing for IBM because it had never been done before. So it's that ability to be able to not be afraid of failure, on the one hand, because if you get too risk averse, you tend to basically not push as hard, and you tend to, I think, miss opportunities. So that's what it was. And I've had some great mentors along the way, to connect that in. Just thinking about this idea about failure, when you think about finance folks or the finance function in general, we've got a really well-earned reputation for kind of spotting risks before they become problems. You think about, who does leadership turn to when they're looking for ways to avoid financial pitfalls with a strategy? They call up finance, and playing it safe with corporate resources generally serves us really well. But what about our careers? Does it pay to play safe there as well? And that was a question that hit me really hard when a mentor that I had worked with a number of years ago, a gentleman by the name of Lon Greenberg, who was the CEO of UGI. He asked, and he said, "Look, you're great at protecting the company's money, but when was the last time you took a risk yourself?" And it made me realize that I'd been kind of applying my own risk-averse mindset, not just to kind of the work decisions, but also to my own career. And what that resulted in was a hesitation to share ideas in meetings unless I was 100% sure they were perfect. Turning down some opportunities to do different things because I was worried that they might expose weaknesses in my own skill set, even though they could have been great, kind of career accelerators. Thinking back to it, so something had to change. And what I did, Jack, was actually challenge myself not to fail at failing. Set a goal to fail at 3 things over the following year. And obviously, being a finance guy, these were risk-adjusted failures, so nothing catastrophic happened. But over time, that fear of failure subsided. And what I felt was it made me a much more valuable business partner. And lessons learned along the way, if anything, would be that while I can't always avoid failure, what I can do is I can try and make it happen quicker. So I can learn quicker. I can do more experiments in the same amount of time. And that's kind of, what's kind of really, I think, best prepared me to come to Phenom, because this is a business that is kind of growing at breakneck speed. We're actually, we part of our culture is to fail fast, because we know that we don't have all the answers. The only thing we can do is experiment, reiterate what we learn, and go and move forward. So that's a mindset you got to have, and I think some of that might be innate. You've just got to be comfortable with failure. A lot of finance people tend not to be, but I think you can, like my own journey, get there if you do it in a structured kind of a way.
No, that's great. And yeah, you mentioned failing fast. I think, is that a mantra in Silicon Valley? I've heard a lot of people who work there say similar things over the years. So.
Yeah. It really is, because when you're trying to build, great companies, or you're trying to, push the frontiers of knowledge, you got to fail fast, right? You don't want to linger on something. And, if you think it's dead, you got to just, accept that and move on. It is a mantra, though.
It makes sense. So one thing I'm curious, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but Mahi is not only the CEO, is he the founder of the company too?
He's a co-founder, correct.
Co-founder, yeah. So, coming in as an outsider, and you didn't have the prior working relationship with him. So how do you, as the incoming CFO, build a relationship with, an obvious genius who's very passionate about the company? And, I'm not suggesting it's egotistical, but, there's a different sense of ownership when you're the founder of the company versus when you just work at the company. So how do you build that meaningful strategic partnership?
Yeah, I'll start by saying, I think I'm fortunate in the sense that compared to many of the founders, given his vision for this business, he understands that the only way we're going to scale to the size that we need to be in order to help 1 billion people discover the right work is he's going to have to let go. And that tends to be one of the biggest challenges with founders is, it's their baby, right? Quote unquote. And letting go is very hard for them. I think Mahi instinctively knows he's going to have to let go. And part of the reason I was brought in was to help him scale himself, if you will. So I had a bit of a head start there. But, I think the question is a really good one, obviously. But, it's not that dissimilar, I don't think, to most CEO relationships that I've had. And what does that look like? If you think about your typical CEO and you think about the personality, these are people that are driven, they're ambitious, they've got a vision, and failure is not an option for them. If they're not succeeding, they're just waiting to succeed. And a big part of that is actually, developed around an inability or an unwillingness to hear no, right? They want to charge ahead full speed, and they don't want to hear about obstacles. They don't want to hear no, and they want to kind of just be able to get it done. That's what makes a CEO typically successful. What makes a CFO successful is actually saying no, and a lot of times, right? I think the worst thing a CFO can do is kind of say yes all the time. Now, if it makes sense to say yes, you should absolutely say yes. But what I've learned in my career is that you've got to be able to kind of temper some of the enthusiasm, let's call it, that CEOs might have for some ideas by saying no. And it's that ability to be able to say no without offending them, by making them stop and think. And that's actually what gains their respect. What I've learned is that CEOs actually expect their CFO to tell them no. That's the guardrail. That they look at their CFO as their guardrail. And if you're not able to do that, a lot of the value goes away from that partnership, if you will. So, what I try and do with Mahi is I try and get him to stop and think. And he does. He's obviously a genius. Like I said, he's a very fast thinker. And because he thinks about the long term, it's not terribly hard to do that. But the partnership is around being able to do that in a way that, doesn't turn him off or get his guard up, that he wants to dig in and just, basically overrule the objection.
That makes sense because, it's not like you're supposed to be there. No. But, some people have shared a philosophy that's, roughly support them in public, but challenge them in private. And by the way, a lot of CEOs now say, CFO is the only one who'll do it for me. And you don't want to be surrounded by a bunch of yes men and women, right? Sometimes, what's the expression? The emperor has no clothing. Sometimes it's on you to say so, right? So
yeah, absolutely. And your point is right on. Which is, number one, I would never ever air any disagreement that I might have, other than in my one-on-one with my CEO, and that'd be the same for all the prior CEOs as well. I've never been able to kind of write something, without fear of it being taken out of context. That conversation, I think, is important. I think it's also important to have that face-to-face conversation. It makes me really think about, well, what am I going to say? What might he respond with? What would I respond to his response with? So it really forces you to have that conversation in your mind And just the nature of being able to do that face to face, I think it really kind of forces you to confront how important is this. And ultimately, what I've told all of my CEOs is I'll support any. Ultimately, it's your call. As long as you're not asking me to do something illegal or unethical, I'll support you. I'll give you my point of view. But once we make a decision, I'm going to be in lockstep with you. And that's really the part of like supporting them in public that becomes really important.
Yeah, you can't. You just can't challenge the CEO publicly. I mean, unless the person's lying or something like that, right? But
yeah.
Because I've had a couple of those awkward moments at board meetings. It's like, good God, make the words stop coming out of your mouth. That's not true. He wasn't lying.
Yeah.
He just didn't understand something and couldn't admit that. So he just kind of kept going. It's like, oh,
yeah.
Good God.
Yeah.
We all have those moments. Doesn't sound like you have those with Mahi. But I want to, ask a question, and you're probably, your answer to it will be quite interesting, because of your experiences in the company you work now. But, it's an interesting company, rapidly growing. I don't tend to think of Philadelphia as a tech mecca. So, how do you build a world-class team around this unicorn type company? Recruit, motivate, train the talent, not only in finance and accounting, but, CFOs today, they're across the entire enterprise. So, what's your philosophy and what are some of the things you can share with building a team like that?
I think it starts with actually learning, right? So I've now been in a number of positions where I've had to go in and kind of build a team, if you will, whether it's Philadelphia or, any other city that I've worked in. And the common denominator, I think, in all of that, Jack, is really about learning about the business, because ultimately the team has to serve the business, right? Not my own ego or my own desire, but it's got to serve the business. And if you're coming into a role that's new, you've really got to understand what the business needs. And it takes about 30 days, to do that. So I think, a lot of times where people can go wrong when they're trying to build a team is moving too fast and trying to make changes based on prior patterns that they may have seen without fully, assessing whether those patterns are still appropriate for the current situation. So it starts out, let's really understand what the business needs. And that a lot of times is, it could be a one-day strategy session with all the stakeholders, and just asking them, hey, what do you think finance should continue doing? What should we stop doing? What should we start doing? And that surfaces all kinds of ideas. And I'm never shocked anymore about what people think finance should be doing, because they've developed their own ideas about what finance is, right? But once you've got that inventory, what people think you should be doing, it becomes a much easier conversation to have around, well, okay, we're not currently set up to do X, Y, and Z. And either we don't think we can do that, or we can do that, but we need more resources. Because that's where the rub is, right? Like, you get the right funding and the right resources to actually deliver on expectations that people have for your group. And when people realize, okay, well, that means more investment, or it might mean some other, reallocation of resources, you kind of get that list down to something that everybody aligns on as to what finance should be doing. So that's a starting point. And then after that, it's really around kind of making sure you're filling those holes, right? There's a lot of things where I've found in every case, finance, over time takes on opportunities and takes on other responsibilities that might have made sense when they were taken on, but 2, 3, 4 years later, they don't make any sense at all. You should stop doing those and then allocate the resources to what the business is looking for. I think, in terms of kind of geographic location, certainly I think there's a higher receptivity now to kind of remote work and kind of finding best people wherever they might be. And that's something that, used to be the case a little bit more, or rather a little bit less before the pandemic. I know things are kind of moving back to return to office, but I think, some hybrid is likely going to exist in the right situation, right? So if I really needed a SaaS expert, for example, and there's not a lot of those type of people in PA, as you can imagine, I could go to the Silicon Valley area. I could go to New York, which, kind of has good pools of people like that, but they're expensive, right? So, So the approach that we've taken is, well, okay, you know what? We can teach you the technical stuff. What's the innate stuff that, I can't really instill in somebody? It goes back to the curiosity. Do you have a willingness to learn, and do you have a desire to make an impact? And what I found is, if you bring people in like that, you can actually teach them the technical stuff, if they're willing to learn it.
Absolutely. That makes sense. And then, another question, and I sometimes joke that I'm required to ask this question, but about Gen AI or AI in general, what's the impact that AI is going to have on jobs and maybe even the job market generally?
Yeah, look, I think that's the billion or the $1 trillion question, right? I think at this point, but I'd say that AI is probably already beginning to transform the job market, and we're literally just getting started. And the biggest shift, really, in the last few, I'd say, months, is that AI has gone from being, think about it as a tool, to really becoming an agent that can now act on its own, and that's the game changer, right? These AI agentic models. And what that really means at the end of the day is that any job that involves a lot of repetitive, predictable tasks, they're likely just not going to exist in the near future. Think about kind of customer service roles. Think about even entry level financial analysis role. Even in the legal space, AI can draft reports, reconcile accounts, write code faster than humans ever could, and much more accurately. But that doesn't mean that humans become obsolete. It just means that the nature of work is evolving. And we've seen this pattern repeat, right? When PCs came out, when the internet came out, it didn't mean that jobs were, lost in totality. It just meant that jobs became different. And then, on top of all of that, there's an even maybe bigger trend taking place, which is the merging of what I would call the physical, digital, and biological worlds. So you think about AI powered wearables, how they're changing healthcare. Think about digital twins that Amazon and Tesla and people like that are using in their manufacturing facilities, or in finance, where AI is making risk analysis and fraud detection way more sophisticated than it's ever been. We're kind of moving into this world where resources are no longer capital and human. They're actually maybe a blur of those two, right? And that line is getting kind of blurrier every day. And you think about HR and you think about talent management and CHROs, this is a huge shift. CHROs are used to dealing with human resources, but now they may have to deal with robotic resources, that potentially do the same work that humans were doing. Where does that sit? When you think about those big strategic questions, that's exactly where Phenom really comes in. It's why we exist. Because what that really means is companies are going to need to stop and rethink what they're hiring for. It goes back to what I talked about with the pattern matching of inferred skills and things like that. Because if AI can handle routine tasks, you need your human workers to focus on things like problem solving, creativity, emotional intelligence, all those areas where AI still, doesn't really do much. So the key becomes hiring for adaptability rather than just the technical skills or a prior, demonstration of what you've done. Secondly, how companies manage talent will change. AI can personalize training. It can predict burnout before it happens, maybe even analyze team dynamics. But it also raises kind of big ethical questions, right? How do you ensure AI-driven hiring decisions are fair? How do you prevent bias from creeping in? And at the end of the day, what it means is that AI isn't just changing jobs. It really is changing kind of what it means to do work. And the people that succeed aren't going to be the people that know how to use AI, but it's going to be those that can collaborate with it in ways to create new value. So I'd say the best thing that any profession can do right now is stay curious, keep learning, and be ready to adapt, because this shift is coming, and it may come faster than we think, or expect it to.
That I think you're spot on. We'll know for sure in a few years, but if nothing else, it's a fascinating time to be in the workforce. But so
sure.
When we were chatting last week, you said some things that I thought were interesting, and my colleague Jess referred to them as your approach to success. And I just wanted to touch upon them briefly. You had three that really stuck out to me. And the first one is not necessarily intuitive to CFOs, and yet I would argue that it's critical. Knowing how to sell an idea.
Yeah, I learned this one the hard way, and I'm happy to share that lesson with you. A few years ago, I was championing and leading a major project that was meant to revolutionize at the time how we manage commodity price risk. And there's a variant of value at risk, right, which is a well-proven model, but we were adapting that for our particular use case. And on paper, this is a no-brainer. Demonstrably higher margins, lower risk, clear path to success. what's not to love, right? But I made a critical mistake. I assumed the idea would sell itself. So I didn't invest any time in bringing key stakeholders along with that journey. And I missed, or maybe just completely outright ignored, resistance that I kind of saw bubbling earlier on, under the false impression that a rock-solid business case by itself would convince people. But instead, what happened was I kind of hit every single barrier that you can probably hit to change management. And I'll just go through them just to kind of share some of the lessons learned. The first one was a lack of trust. What I didn't realize is that people may nod their heads and agree with you, but that doesn't mean that they believe that change is actually going to do anything of any value. They just weren't vocalizing it. There's another one around uncertainty, and this is where people feared how it would impact them, and they weren't voicing it. Maybe they were afraid to voice it. But, thinking back, these were people that had learned a process, had applied that process in some cases for decades. They knew how to do it. They knew how to look good doing it. They knew how to get compensated doing it. And I come along and I upend all of that, right? So there's all that uncertainty and fear that's under the surface that people don't always, raise in these meetings. The other one was differing perceptions, where I saw solutions, people saw problems, and that conversation never had a chance to really take place. So we never, resolved, which side of those things were on. Conflicting interests, right? I mean, when you think about change management of that magnitude, you're going to have winners and losers, and you got to be able to reach out to those people and understand things from their perspective. And the last one is probably just emotional pushback. People don't want to change a lot of times. It's maybe an innate human kind of a feeling where, status quo is safe. That status quo works. Why change it? And people don't want to take that, leap to do something different because somebody's got a better business case. And the result of all of that was, this model that we built never got fully adopted and ultimately died a slow death. And not because it was a bad idea, but just because I failed to get that buy-in from all constituencies. And the company spent close to $1 million on that project. So the lesson that I learned was that, persuading isn't about logic. It's about relationships. If you want to make a change, have an impact, and have people embrace change, you got to build a trust. You got to address their concerns, make them feel like they're part of the process, build the relationships. And, that's a lesson that I learned the hard way at a cost of $1 million, but one that that I'll never forget.
Yeah, it wasn't your money. So, but yeah, I'm sure it felt like it. No, that makes a lot of sense. And then one of the other things you said, and you touched on it a little bit earlier, but listen and remain curious. Is that something is that just your nature, Davinder, or is that something you consciously put effort into to develop good habits? And how does that pay off for a CFO?
It was pretty triggered during a management training session when I was at IBM. So one of the things that IBM does really well is they help their resources move from department to department. And one of the very first things that I learned in that session was the idea of, if you're going from department A to department B, think about yourself like a virus. And when you go into department B, you're the virus, and everybody in that department is going to kind of basically act as antibodies. And the way you overcome that is you've got to basically, fit in and look like them and feel like them so they don't feel threatened by you. If you go in with kind of like an agenda and you go in looking like a virus, you're going to get a very severe and immediate reaction.
Yeah.
How do you not do that? This is where the idea of learning really came from. It was about just go in and take the time to learn. You may think you've got the best idea in the world, but that doesn't mean somebody hasn't already tried it. That doesn't mean there's a reason it's not going to succeed. And you gotta snuff all that stuff out, right? And I think the tendency for most folks that are ambitious and driven is, I want to have an impact on day one. And I've talked about curiosity and learning and having an impact. And I think, for me, that impact or having an impact was maybe more overweighted earlier in my career. And what I've learned is, to have that bigger impact, you've got to be curious, you got to learn, and ultimately, really develop the right plan to be impactful. So I think at this point, it probably feels like second nature, but if I'm honest with you, it's not something that I had innately. I did have to work at it, and I had to develop it over time.
Yeah, most habits do require a little bit of work. Some things we're born in, and then the last one, and it's perhaps the most important, but it's more of a life thing than a business thing, perhaps. But don't confuse success with happiness. And what does that mean? I mean, I know what it means, but what does it mean to you? So,
Yeah, I think a lot of people assume that those two are the same thing, but in my mind, they're actually very different. I think of success as being external to me. It's about achievements, promotions, financial rewards, and things of that nature. Happiness, though, is about something that's more internal. It comes from why I'm here, what's the meaning of my life, relationships, and am I truly fulfilled with my life? There's a great book written by Jonathan Haidt called The Happiness Hypothesis that I read a few years ago. And he has a great metaphor that he uses. He talks about our mind being like a rider on an elephant. The rider represents kind of our logical, goal-driven, side, that the part that plans and strategizes and really chases success. The elephant is the emotional side. Think about that as our need for connection, purpose, and well-being. And the point of the book was that you can push the rider as hard as you want, but if the elephant's unhappy, you're gonna feel unhappy. You're gonna feel unfulfilled, and no matter how much you achieve, you're never gonna feel that sense of fulfillment that I think we crave. So that's kind of maybe one distinction. The other, kind of real eye opener for me was, again, from the book, was the idea of this hedonic treadmill. And we all think about just getting that next milestone, right? That next raise, that next title, that corner office, whatever it is, will finally make us happy. And it does, right? But only for a short period of time, because what ends up happening is we've all got a set point of our expectations in life. And once you get to that next level, you kind of got a euphoric high, but then you normalize back to where you were originally. And the book actually mentions a really great study about looking at the lives of lottery winners and quadriplegics. And what they found was that even though the lottery winners, kind of experienced this high after winning the lottery, 2 years later, they were exactly where they were, at the start of that journey. And the same for quadriplegics. So we adapt, kind of very quickly to kind of our circumstances. And that's why kind of chasing that next milestone is never going to give you the satisfaction, because you're just going to find something else to go get. My challenge to folks that I mentor these days is don't just chase success. Design a career that actually makes you happy. Yeah, work hard, aim high, build wealth, and do all those sorts of things. But don't ever lose sight of why you're doing it. And success should be a tool to make you happy and to give you fulfillment, not an end goal in itself. So invest in the relationships, find purpose in what you're doing, make sure you're building the life that you want to actually live.
Well, that's great. I want to turn a little back to AI, to Phenom. And I'm curious, great success story, but what do you think are some of the biggest challenges and opportunities facing the company in the next few years?
Where we sit, Jack, right? So we are still a small business, despite being a unicorn, and the success that we've had. And I would say the greatest challenge and the greatest opportunity are probably two sides of the same coin, right? Maybe not surprisingly. We do think we're sitting in a very, very interesting point in kind of just life in general, given this seismic change that's going to come with AI. And the opportunity is going to be around some of the stuff I just talked about around AI agents and how the workforce gets transformed because of that. I'll give you some statistics maybe to kind of help make that more real and concrete. If you think about just the United States, there's about 1 million people that work in HR in some capacity or other. And you think about the average salary that people make, and you end up with a payroll just in HR of about $100 billion. I mean, it's a big spend in total. But if you think about what these AI agents can do, it's not inconceivable that you could basically, take out about a quarter of that cost. You're talking about a $250 billion potential opportunity, or TAM, if you will, in business speak. And the way that we think about business is if we can go capture, let's say, 10% of that, that becomes a $25 billion business. And that's exciting, right? Because that will certainly allow us to do what we want to do to further our mission. And we're actually building tools, and we're planning around how we can basically help that come about. The risk, of course, is somebody beats us to it, right? It's the blind spot. In technology, you're always, kind of paranoid a little bit because you know what you know, but you don't know what you don't know. There's a bunch of startups that are forming every day, doing great work. Some of the funding that's going into these businesses is incredible, and the risk becomes that somebody beats us to that punch.
No, it's quite a special opportunity and some challenges. But
Yeah.
I also want to talk in your role as a CFO, and it wasn't all that long ago that strategy and finance were almost different things. Like they lived in their own silos to an extent. But your role as the CFO is to make sure that doesn't happen. And, unless you happen to work for a company, 1 in 100 where the CEO is a former CFO, you're the only person who's a strategic thinker and a financial expert. So it's incumbent upon you to make sure that they're sort of talking to each other, right? How does one do that?
Through the AOP, or the annual operating process, planning process. I mean, to me, that is the glue. And if you do that right, you can link those two things very, very closely for the reason you just talked about, Jack, right? And the beauty of the AOP is that's what most compensation plans are based off of. And when people's compensation's at risk, they tend to pay attention to stuff, right? So the key becomes for a CFO, I think, to really make sure that annual planning process is tethered closely to the strategy. And like most businesses, your planning process may involve an annual fiscal cycle, but the investments that you're making and the initiatives that you're doing, they tend to have lives that are shorter or longer than a year, right? That's just a fiscal creation. So the idea becomes to make sure that the planning process takes into consideration not just what happens this year, but that multi-year kind of a view. But that's how I've done it, And if you can do that in the right way, and you've got a good outside-in view about where we want the company to be, I always start out thinking I want to be in the top decile of all high-growth companies. Well, what do the metrics of those businesses look like? That informs me what my planning process needs to deliver, and then I've got to make sure that I've got the right behaviors and the right compensation incentives built in to drive that.
That makes sense. And I believe you are, or at least were, a CPA at one point in your career. Is that correct? So
that's correct. Yeah.
But, it's, great for a rules-based system, but sometimes those aren't the best metrics for measuring business performance. But what are some of your favorite, KPIs, if you will, that you use to determine success or failure at Phenom?
Yeah. So, being a SaaS business, we've got some SaaS, software as a service business for folks that may not be familiar with that term. We have some very, very unique metrics that are important to us that, we look at. And to your point, probably are more relevant from a valuation perspective than the GAAP numbers are. I don't think there's actually any SaaS software business in my lifetime that's ever traded on any GAAP number, and not to diminish the importance of GAAP, because ultimately, that's the final check on what we report. But the numbers that we tend to look at are things like gross retention. So how many of our customers are we retaining? Net retention, which is how much are those customers buying more of our product? Because you want to expand that relationship over time. That's a good indicator that people are getting value out of what you're selling them. And then in the SaaS space in particular, there's a concept called the rule of 40. And that's basically the sum of your growth rate plus your profitability should be 40 or higher. And that's really a capital allocation technique. So that's kind of what I mostly spend my time looking at and trying to improve.
Boy, I haven't been a CFO since like 2007. Y'all are still using the rule of 40, huh? That's good to know.
Yeah, it's coming back into vogue. It kind of lost, favor for a little bit when multiples got blown out, because that's the only way you could fund these things. But it's come back with a vengeance.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, It's good. I like the basicness of the rule, right? It's intuitive, and you can calculate it pretty simple, and it leads you to the right conclusion long term. So, but I want to switch gears a little bit, and I know you have 3 kids, and so you have a lot going on. One of the challenges for CFOs, and I think for executives generally, is the work-life balance, or as a few people have corrected me and said the work-life integration. But what's your secret to doing that? Because from what I know about you, you seem to probably have a pretty good grip on those sorts of things.
The thing that's really helped me has been to integrate my my goals and my to-do list, if you will, for work and for home. And when you do that, you prioritize what you're going to do today, it helps you really focus on what's most important. And sometimes it's going to be something at work. Most of the time, it's going to be something at work. But there are times where there's something on the personal to-do list that, when I look at the totality of what I've got to get done, I can tell it's going to be more important to do that. And that's also from the lens of not looking at it just today, but looking at it from the perspective, hey, how will I feel about this decision a month from now? Am I going to regret this priority order a month from now, a year from now? And that helps keep me grounded. It really does, and there are times where I've got to say, look, I just, I can't do this. And I will say the culture at Phenom, given the background and what we're trying to do, it's around empowering people to be productive in their work lives, really through kind of having flexibility in your personal life. So I'm thankful for that. But yeah, that'd be, the secret, if you will.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So, and one thing I like to, conclude with is, what's your advice for the next generation of CFOs? And I'm thinking controllers, VPs of finance, and even people who are in their CFO for the first time. What should they be thinking about in terms of skills to develop, how to form relationships, whatever it is in your mind that you kind of wish you knew earlier in your career?
The one thing that I wish I'd learned earlier was, the idea of selling ideas. It's not innate to most CFOs or finance people. It's not innate to me. But I think that's becoming more important for the role. What's happening is, or as I see this role evolving over the next 5-10 years, which a lot of these folks that are aspiring to get into the role, into the seat, during that period of time, I think it's a fantastic opportunity, way more than I had. And the reason for that is, if you think about, what we used to call the chief operating officer role, you don't see as many of those anymore. That role is actually slowly declining, and for the most part tends to be only in a situation where somebody's being groomed for the CEO role. So the idea of a COO is kind of going by the wayside. But that's great news for CFOs, because I think CFOs are becoming that COO, and that gives us the ability to move out of, call it the accounting and the numbers and just the gap stuff, into having an impact on the business. So I would say, remain curious, learn about the business, really understand where the value drivers are. If you can do that, and you can sell ideas, and you can create relationships and build trust, I think any CFO with that complement of skills could be truly dangerous in terms of what they can accomplish.
Well, I think that is fantastic advice. And Davinder, this has been a great conversation, a lot of fun, some fantastic insights. And I know you got a lot going on, so I'm certainly grateful for your time. But I'd just love to give you the final word. If there's any things you'd like to recap or just share with our listeners, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, maybe just, one thing, Jack, and that is, maybe not directly related to finance, but one thing I've learned about life is, if you're clear about where you want to go, the universe has a way to kind of orchestrate events and things around you to drive you to that point, and you're going to get there one way or another. And the best thing you can do is get out of your own way and get there as quickly as you can, because it's powerful.
That wraps up this episode of the Secrets of Rockstar CFOs. A huge thank you to our sponsors, Plantful and Travel Bank. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review at rockstarcfos.com. Until next time, rock on.
Thank you for listening to this episode. To continue your exploration of this role that focuses on strategy, leadership, finance, and technology, listen to more episodes of the show at rockstarcfos.com. Join this revolution, episode by episode. Push yourself to achieve great things and unlock the best opportunities available to you. CFOs are creating a legacy, and it's time for you to leave your own unique imprint on the world today. That's all for now. See you on the next one.